Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right, it's my pleasure to welcome Peter Dollar here today to give us a talk on object recognition. He graduated from the University of San Diego under the advising of Serge, right? And the last few years has been at Caltech, studying some biologically inspired works as well as computer vision. And today he's been talking about more of the computer vision aspects, I believe.
All right, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. So it's a pleasure today to tell you about my work in object-centered visual recognition. And so the goal of my work is to take an image and discover and find all the objects in the scene, but not to just find the objects, but to actually characterize their properties in some more detail. And so first I'll tell you about my work in detection, so just finding and naming the objects, and then in recovering their pose, their geometric configuration of the objects, tracking the objects, so determining their motion, and not just the motion of their center of mass, but actually their changes in their geometric configuration, and then characterizing the behavior of the objects themselves. So my talk will be, I'll tell you about each of these, my work in each of these areas, with a specific focus on the detection, and so I'll more briefly talk about the latter parts. We'll see how we're doing on time in the latter part of the talk. So throughout, all the methods I'm going to talk about have sort of three properties that I think are crucial if we want computer vision algorithms to be applicable in the real world. They're data-driven, they're robust, and they're efficient. And so data-driven, what that really means is that it's easy to adapt into a different domain. To adapt into a different domain, you just get a new data set. They're robust, meaning that, well, they work well, but they also work under adverse conditions, so not just the conditions in a lab where we gather some nice clean images. And they're efficient, so computationally fairly quick. And this is important both if you have applications where you simply need real-time feedback. For example, if you have a vehicle and you want the vehicle to, an automatic system to warn the driver if, say, there's pedestrians in the road, you need the feedback to be very fast. But also if you have sort of low-power devices like cell phone, you can have algorithms that, on a standard computer take minutes to run. So all these are sort of aspects that I think are crucial for successful algorithms, and there's something I'll focus throughout all the different methods I'll talk about. And so I'm going to start talking about detection. And I'll tell you a little bit about the challenges here. And this is actually, I gave a talk here in June, so some of you might have seen this. So I'll discuss this very briefly. Then I'll talk at some length about our detection framework that has evolved over a number of years. And I think what we've ended up with is a very simple system. We've sort of pruned a lot of the complexities out. But at the same time, it's very effective. So I'll tell you sort of what goes into that. And then I'll tell you about a recent effort, recent insight that allowed all of this to be made much, much faster. So first of all, one of the things we realized when we were working in this is that the existing data sets in object recognition didn't really capture what we wanted them to capture when we wanted to really look at what's working and what's not. And so there's been an emphasis on going to a large number of categories, so continuously increasing number of categories, culminating in Feifei's recent effort on ImageNet. But I think there hasn't been enough of a focus in going into a large number of images per category, where you can really see for that one category at least what is really the difficulty there. Sure, here are the difficulties if you need to distinguish 1,000 different classes, but for this one class, what are the challenges there? The other thing with a lot of these data sets for object recognition is that they have some fairly strong level of bias in the sense that the images were hand-picked, so somebody went through their vacation photo and said, oh, this is a good image to use. Or they went through a search engine or something like tagging, like Flickr, where people labeled, say, this had a pigeon in it. And, the pigeon is very central, which might not be representative if you wanted to detect all pigeons and all images, including small ones in the background. And so we introduced the Caltech pedestrian dataset, which I think addressed these issues. And I'll tell you briefly about that, but essentially what the main focus was to really drill down in one category, a lot of images, no bias. And so so this is the data set, it's available online, and it's since we've introduced it, it's starting to get more widely adopted. The way we gathered is we had a camera hooked up in a vehicle. And so really, if you're driving around in a vehicle, these are the types of images you'll see. So in that sense, it's very unbiased. We had a labeling tool and hired a bunch of annotators, so we had a huge amount of data. So it's something like 250,000 labeled frames with 350,000 bounding boxes of pedestrians, and we labeled them in some detail, including occlusion mass. So again, I'm just going to briefly touch upon this, but one of the things we found is that you see sort of where human perception is. So these are images that are just been downsampled and upsampled, so they have an effective resolution. So they're all actually at the same resolution, but they have an effective resolution that's different. And here is sort of 3264 pixels. You really can distinguish the pedestrian in this case fairly accurately. Even at 32, maybe there's some ambiguity, but at 64 you can definitely distinguish it. Lower, probably not. So this is where humans are at. Algorithms are down here right now. And I think we really have sort of a way to go. And I think this has sort of practical implications, but it also is showing that maybe perhaps the representation we have, the images for our computer algorithms, isn't really doing an effective job of extracting all the information out of the image that we'd want. And for example, in this data set, it turned out that most of the pedestrians were actually in this height range, somewhere in here. And the fact that algorithms that don't do well there is a big challenge. The other thing we looked at was occlusion. So I think occlusion is one of those things that we all know for object recognition is an important thing to deal with, but yet we're not really dealing with it. In fact, there hasn't even been a data set that has occlusions labeled. So we did this for people, and it turned out that most of the time, so without going sort of all the details here, most of the time people are in fact occluded. But there is some hope. If you look at the pattern of occlusion, so this is sort of the average visible region, so blue here indicates regions that are visible. The head of the people tends to always be visible, whereas the lower part of the body isn't and the sides isn't. So it's very non-uniform, so it's not like that every part of the person is equally likely to be occluded. And moreover, if we cluster sort of the different occlusions, these 7 occlusion masks here account for something like 98% of the occlusion. So 98% of the time, conditioned on the fact that a person's occluded, this is the portion that will be visible, one of these, and not say, well, their middle region's occluded or their head's occluded or something else. So this is really information that we really want to be able to exploit in the long run. So we also went and we gathered a very large number of detectors. So each one of these, and exactly whose detectors these are isn't so important, but each one of these is a detector from a sort of a leading computer vision group, and if you're interested, that's on the website or in my papers. So here's, for example, HOG and a number of others. And what I'm showing here is false positives per image on the x-axis and the miss rate on the y-axis. So you want low false positives per image and low miss rate. So you want to be sort of in the lower left corner. And you see that there's sort of a spread and things are getting better. This is a log-log scale, so actually a shift is actually a pretty big deal. But we still have quite a way to go. So it's say 1 false positive per image. We're detecting about 60% of the pedestrians. So it's something, but it's really not quite there. So the systems I'm going to tell you about today, these are R2 algorithms. So this is all without using any kind of context, without any motion. This is just classifications of pedestrian. They're not independently for every window. These are R2 detectors I'll be telling you about today. This is our base detector, and this is a sped up one. You can kind of see where they perform. One of the things we did was we asked sort of what the progress has been over the last decade and where we're going. Now, it's always a little dangerous to extrapolate, but this is around circa 2000. So this is, by the way, on the internet pedestrian data set, which is a slightly easier data because people are larger, there's no occlusions, and there's just fewer, the pedestrian takes up a larger fraction of the image. Back in around 2000, if we just take Viola Jones, this is where it's at. So to get, say, 80% detection, we were at about 1 false positive. 5 years later, Dalal and Triggs introduced, and I'm showing a very selective number of papers, obviously, from the literature. 5 years later, Dalal and Triggs introduced their HOG features, and this is the curve you get. And you may say, okay, well, that's not that big of a gap. But remember, this is a log-log scale, so going from here to here, going 1 grid cell is actually a reduction of a factor of 10 in false positives. So it really is actually something. This is where we're at today, so this is our own method. And so you can see that really there has been pretty dramatic progress. For a given detection rate, we have, in just 10 years, reduced it by 100-fold. So that's really, really something. At the same time, where we're today is still not where we want to be. 1 false positive every 10 images for 80% detection rate. Maybe we could argue exactly where we want to be, but really it'd be more over here. And so, like I said, it's very dangerous to extrapolate because, there's no physical law that says we'll be making, no Moore's law that's saying that the hardware will increase at a certain rate. But I do think that this is somewhere we'll get within about 5-10 years. Yes? So that's actually an excellent question. That's one of the things we want to do. So we don't have that data point, and it's a little bit challenging to get that data point. So if you take the whole image and you have people label, so they get to use context and everything else, then they're actually doing quite well. Like especially in this kind of data set where so one of the things about this data set was hand-selected images. So it's hand-selected, so there's very little ambiguity. So I would say humans here are actually close to perfect. One of the things we've really wanted to do, and a lot of Larry's work has addressed this to some extent in terms of what is human performance and sort of where do humans work and algorithms don't. One of the things we wanted to do is really do context-less, so we present people with windows and have them make a decision. So we're still trying to figure out how to set up that experiment properly, because the difficulty with it is, first of all, there's a million windows we'd have to show the people. But let's say we have a budget and we have mTurk, so maybe that's okay. But then there becomes this problem is that it's a rare event actually having a pedestrian. Most of the windows don't. And if you give, say, farm out to mTurk this kind of task where you have rare events, it really biases people's responses. So even if they could detect, maybe they just start hitting no, 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 no. And so basically what we have to do that experiment, so one of the possibilities is if we can get a detector that has 100% recall at a fairly low false positives per image, like let's say 1,000 false positive per image but 100% recall, then we could use that as a first filter and then perform a human study. Using sort of a detector that only gets 90% performance to do that isn't as compelling. So anyway, the short story is we really want to have that data point, but we haven't figured out quite the right way to get it yet. So there's been some progress. So this is unoccluded, fairly large pedestrians. So this is going back to the Caltech pedestrian data set, and these are the difficult cases. This is low resolution and occluded. And basically what you see is here at this point, this is where performance is essentially abysmal right now. So no matter, even if you go to lots and lots of false positive per image, you're only detecting maybe 20% of the people. And again, here I don't think actually in this case, your question of where would human performance be, it wouldn't be perfect, absolutely not. Especially since when we had humans label this, we used motion. They can go back and forth in the video, they can identify a large pedestrian and then go back in time and get the smaller. So certainly here for static and certainly for context-less detections, human would not be perfect. But the algorithm is definitely quite poor. Yes?
It seems to me that resolution is not as important. So you can get almost any resolution you want. So why they focus on resolution?
That's true. I think there's sort of two reasons. One is a practical one, and one is sort of a scientific one. So the practical one is, so it depends on the application. In some, absolutely, cell phones, the resolution goes up every year, even if necessarily the quality of the image doesn't. It's funny because in the application we're working on, which was vehicles, it turns out, so vehicle, let's say a vehicle is $30,000. It turns out that only about 10% of that cost is actual parts and labor, and everything else is, or 10% is parts, everything else is labor, marketing, sales, shipping, etc. And so for them, so when you talk about, so let's say a camera, a high resolution camera, which also requires more computational complexity, slightly faster processor, let's say that's an extra $50. That's $50 not on top of $30,000, on top of $3,000. And for them, their margins are so small on that they're very, very against that. It's funny because you'd say, spend another $50, we'll have resolution. But I agree. In some applications, absolutely, for the practical reason, it's not so important, right? Say cell phones, cameras are increasing their resolution. Why worry about it? So I agree with that. So it will depend on the application. But from a scientific point of view, I think going back here, when I look at these images, or when people look at these images, clearly you can do detection at a relatively low resolution. Now, so just because humans can do it, well, we can kind of compensate with hardware, so why not compensate with hardware? But I think the fact that we can't properly extract information from these images is actually telling us we're not extracting information very well. So I think by focusing on lower resolution data, we're forced to say, how can we get all the data out of these pixels? So we're forcing ourselves to solve that problem. And when we solve that problem, or we address that problem, we'll actually help with the whole gamut of resolutions.
Like the human resolution and processing power is fixed. Mm-hmm. So you cannot change the eye resolution, you cannot change your outputs.
But there's focus.
For machines, this is like a trade-off, right? So you can increase resolution or you can increase processing power. So to me, it seems that you should have like a composed axis because
Yeah, so we've looked a lot, like for example, at performance versus resolution, and like I said, I think that will depend on application. Some applications just won't make sense to worry about low resolution. Why not just make up for it with hardware? And so I absolutely agree with that. So let me tell you about our own detection framework. So we use a sliding window paradigm. This is actually basically the dominant paradigm for this type of detection task, not for any other reason than that this is just what seems to work well. And all the top performing methods, for example, on pedestrian detection on the Pascal data set, all tend to be sliding window. In this kind of paradigm, basically there's two steps. So you're classifying every single window in an image, you're downsampling the image and classifying every single window again. And basically there's you can think of it as having two stages. There's extraction of features, and then there's actually some kind of classification, supervised, semi-supervised, etc. But there's these two stages, features and learning, and classification. And so I'm going to tell you about both of our work in both. So on the feature end, basically what we did is, so there's been sort of a lot of specialized features that have been introduced over the years. Let's say HOG or SIFT, and saying, this is the best thing since the best feature yet. And we want to take a little bit of a different approach because we said, well, really we want to take all kinds of different complementary information, but we don't want to have to go and actually, go and code different features. Here's a color feature, and then go code that, or go just get somebody's code for color features. We wanted to really have a homogeneous approach to all these feature types. And so what we basically did is, there's sort of a ton of work in the computer vision literature over the last many, many years about computing different, what I call channels of information, which basically highlight a different, so obviously you always start with the same image, but you're highlighting different aspects of the information in the image. So for example, you could do edge detection on the image, as canny edges. You could run some kind of linear filters, some kind of nonlinear operation. Obviously the information is in some sense in each of these views less than the information in the original image, because you've done some processing and thrown out some information. But at the same time, from the perspective that you're going to be putting learning on top of this, different elements of information get highlighted in these different channels. And so that's the idea. Basically, can we leverage this? Can we take an image, compute lots and lots of different channels? So this is a very simple thing to do from a sort of a systems perspective, because there exists code for, say, computing canny edge detection, gradient histogram, and there exists fast code for that. And no matter what sort of library you're doing, that exists. And so can we leverage this and compute all these channels so we have very homogeneous representation? In some ways, it becomes irrelevant what the underlying information that's being emphasized here is. And then basically what we can do is take and compute integral images over that. And then, so this is a trick from sort of a nice little math trick that from Paul Viola and others, where you can then take a sum of pixels in a rectangular region very, very quickly using just a fixed number of floating point operations. And so the details of that aren't so important, but the point is that we can then compute lots and lots of sort of sums of rectangles or sums of combination rectangles over these, and then these sums are sort of, once we've done some pre-processing, are essentially free or are a fixed cost. And so this gives us an extremely large feature pool to work with, and it lets us, again, the idea is lots of heterogeneous feature types, but in a homogeneous framework. So if we want to add something, we go to a different domain and maybe color is more important, something else more important, we can do that sort of with no effort. So on top of this, we had a very standard learning framework, maybe with some tweaks. At the beginning, we tried to explore sort of random combination or gradient descent, finding the optimal combinations of rectangles to give us the most informative features. We ended up eventually working using random features because it didn't really hurt performance much. Threw this into a boosting framework. So this is actually from some folks here at MSR. Soft cascades is just a very nice variant of cascades, and some decision trees and all this sort of optimized over the years, but no huge fundamental changes from what was there 10 years ago. But it's gotten to the point where it takes 5-10 minutes to train one of these, and there's very few parameters, and it works well. And so here's, for example, the learned channels. So for pedestrian detection, we use gradient histogram channels, and those are sort of the most important ones. Those are the ones that people were using. But then we threw in color channels, and it turned out that in LUV color space, the skin color, actually independent of race, pops out as pretty particular. Now, you may have known that ahead of time, you may have not. but the algorithm can discover that. You give it enough different features, the algorithm will discover the most informative ones. And so, for example, it discovers that, it discovers, the shoulders, the head. So exactly what I'm showing here isn't so important. But the point is that those kind of things you don't have to program in. That's really what the algorithm is going to be discovering. So we had an extension of this to have some notion of articulation. So I have some notion that the features don't have to appear in a fixed location relative to the window you're testing, but they get to move around a little bit, and they get to move around in groups. And this is sort of this notion that when you're doing object detection, there's some level of articulation. So we took basically our feature representation, added a notion of part-based, and we came up with something called multiple component learning. We basically group features into sets, and then those can move around. And so what we actually started with was there's this approach called multiple instance learning. It's an approach for supervised learning, which instead of, so normally in standard supervised learning, in the simplest case, you have your positive examples and you have your negative examples, and you just learn a decision boundary between those. And what multiple instance learning lets you do is, instead of your examples being singletons, they actually come in groups or sets or bags, where now you're trying to make a decision for an entire bag, and you basically say the bag is positive if it contains at least one positive instance. But in training, this really lets you add a little bit of weak supervision, in the sense that you don't have to exactly identify your positive example. You just have to say this region contains your positive example. So what this paper, again, from MSR actually did, what these guys did was use this to, let's say you're trying to learn a head detector, but you don't know exactly what size windows to use, you don't have exact labeling, so you let those move around, and you just kind of say there's a head here, and you let the algorithm figure out which window to use from each training example. So you could use this. So basically what we did is you could say, well, actually you can use this to learn parts. So they were using it to learn an object classifier where you had slop in the labeling of the object. But you can say, well, let's actually treat an object as a collection of windows and try to find sort of the window within all the positive classes that, or sort of the appearance of a window within the positive class that distinguishes it from negatives. And this lets you learn the notion of parts. Of course, a person, you could say, well, actually an image of a person could have lots of different parts, so which one do you focus on? And so what we did essentially is divide the region into lots of overlapping regions. So you can generate these regions, and there can be kind of dense overlap. And for each one, we learn a part detector using MIL. So each one has some notion of slop. And so we learn all these different, using all these, we get a separate part detector sort of for each region. And we get a huge number of part detectors, and there's a lot of redundancy there. But those now actually become weak classifiers inside of a boosting framework. So there's sort of this two layers of learning. First, you learn the parts, and then you feed those into yet another learning step. And that second learning step is the one that picks which are the informative parts and how to combine them in their spatial reasoning. And so this kind of thing actually works well and when you have a decent amount of resolution. And it turns out that when you have relatively low resolution, having a notion of parts doesn't help you, doesn't buy you much. So that's our basic framework. So, I've shown you earlier, I showed you this sort of slide where with the ROC of how things were performing, but really when it comes down to it, when I want to show Pietro that something works, he sends me his vacation photos and I run him on that. So these are his kids skiing, and the detector fires on those, and there's some numbers over them. That's the sort of confidence, and you can convert that to a probability. Here's his kids playing soccer, and in this case, the algorithm hallucinates a little man on the shoulder here. But when I show Pietro images like this, he's like, okay, maybe this is actually working. Maybe you have something. Here's some hiking in the Alps. So here's an image, the kind of thing. This is a more challenging image. There's more stuff going on in here. It gives you a sense of the type of errors the algorithm is making, and you sort of get false positive hallucinate. Of course, here if you were to use, say, scene geometry, which we're not, if you knew where the ground plane was, you could probably eliminate just with that a lot of these. But you kind of see without that, just per window, what the algorithm is hallucinating. And some of them are somewhat reasonable, and some of them aren't. Here's some more hallucinations. And here you can say, well, these hallucinations are pretty reasonable. Some of these are not. Human would never hallucinate a pedestrian there. So one of the things that Pietro was very proud of is he discovered that the algorithm has a lot of false positives in Venice. So it thinks the Venices with the big arched windows are people. And, that gives you a sense of maybe these algorithms still aren't where we'd want to be. They're really not. Because, even just looking locally at that information without the context is very clear that's a window. He discovered that Padua, where he's from, that you don't get these false positives. But in Venice, something about the arch, something in distribution of those features, you do. Here's that example image I was using at the beginning, and you kind of see again, it's doing a decent job at upright people. It's not doing a good job on people in different poses, and this is again why we want to introduce the notion of pose, which I'll talk about later. So you get some sense of how it's working. I showed Pietro this image. He sent me this image, and I said, well, look, it's not working. He said, oh, it detects Venus, so maybe you're okay. So I guess it depends on what your goals are. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you about how we took this baseline system and how we made it all fast. And so basically before, sort of one of the top performing methods was running at something like 5 minutes per image. Let me repeat that, 5 minutes for a single image to get your detection results. So, and that's on like a relatively reasonable computer. And so that's really not, if we want to make these things practical, that's not where we want to be. And our stuff was running, for depending on the resolution and depending on everything, but sort of on, if you want to detect all the small people in a VGA image, it's something like a few seconds per image. So a little more reasonable, but still not where you want to be. And so the sort of insight that I'm going to tell you about now sped that up by a factor of about 10. And so now we can do for, if we want to do sort of small pedestrians, we can do that at a few frames a second. And if we're not so concerned about all the small pedestrians, we can actually bump that up to real time. And so, so this is sort of the technical part of the talk. So what's the idea here? And so the idea is normally if you do multiscale detection, you have some kind of feature, let's say like gradients. You basically have to recompute that feature at every scale, and I'll explain in detail why that is in a second, but basically if you downsample image and recompute the gradients, it's not the same as having the gradients in the individual image downsample. So you basically recompute, let's say you have hog features or whatever they are, you basically build this dense image pyramid where you shrink the pyramid by 10% every time or 5% every time, and you do sliding window detection at each scale. Now if you think about this, is very, very wasteful, because you're recomputing whatever features they are, and those can be pretty rich nowadays, at every single scale of detection. This just doesn't seem the right way to go. So actually when Viola-Jones did their detection framework over a decade ago, they got away without doing this. Since all their features were basically sums of pixels, rectangular sums, they didn't, to do a detection of a larger pedestrian, they didn't have to downsample the image and run the same size model. They could actually change the size of their model, because they could say, instead of doing a sum of a 10 by 10 pixel rectangle, I'm going to do a sum of a 20 by 20 pixel rectangle, say, and I know if I divide that by 4, that's the same if I shrunk the image and did the 10 by 10. So actually that was one of the reasons Viola-Jones was so fast over a decade ago. And now when we wanted to do kind of rich features, which are necessary to get good performance, Viola-Jones just doesn't work that well, because its features, its only view of the image are sums of grayscale values in rectangular regions, captures some notion of gradient, but really is not rich enough to really capture the appearance of most objects. And so things got slow. And so is there anything we can do here? And intuitively you'd think, well, really, is the gradient going to change that much if I shrink the image by 5%? Is it really going to change completely? Do we really have to recalculate everything? And the answer is no. And so if we can approximate features at nearby scales, and that's what really this is going to be about, then we don't have to do this. We don't actually have to resample the image all the way. We can actually approximate features at nearby scales. So we take our original classifier, enlarge it by a little bit by approximating what those features would have been at a larger scale, shrinking our detector a little bit, and do a very, very sparse image pyramid. So if you think about it, if you think that the feature computation is sort of proportional to the number of pixels, then in Viola-Jones, there's basically, if the number of pixels is n, the amount of computation was n, let's say on the order of n. Here, if it's this dense image pyramid, well, it depends on the density, but it can be easily something like 10 times n. If you do this kind of thing, well, it's n plus 1/4 n plus 1/8 n, etc., and that comes out to be about 4/3 n if you do that infinite sum. And so basically what we're going to be doing is getting the benefit of sort of the computational cost will be as if we were really working on the original image at one scale. But the accuracy is going to be as if we had the full rich features, whatever they are, on every scale. And so how does that work? Well, so first of all, features are shift invariant. Most of the features are using computer vision, meaning if we compute a feature, so this arrow here is the feature computation. And for sake of this talk, I'm going to be mostly talking about gradient magnitude, but this will hold for lots of different features. If we compute a feature and then translate it, that's the same as translating an image and computing the feature. And so there's nothing sort of, not all features necessarily would have this property, but most of the ones most of the practical ones that we would use would. So this makes sense, but now when you go to scale, this no longer holds. So if you compute compute, let's say, the gradient magnitude image, now you downsample that image, compute the gradient magnitude, that's not the same as doing, so the order here matters a lot. And so that's why we actually have to resample the image before we recompute the features. It's not enough to just compute the features once and resample those. And so that sort of intuitively makes sense. And again, there's this effect basically that when you downsample, you're sort of blurring away information. So if you have, say, high frequency signal in the image, that goes away. And so then when you compute your feature, which is depending on that high frequency signal, it's just not there. Okay, so is there anything we can do? Because the information is actually lost. So at first glance, it seems like there's nothing we can do. But there actually is, and so let me tell you about that. So first of all, I'm going to just, again, for the sake of discussion, I'm just going to be talking about the gradient magnitude. So I'm going to be talking about a scalar feature over an image, which is computing the gradient magnitude of every pixel and summing those across the whole image. And you see you get a single number out that says here's the gradient, the sum of the gradient magnitude of the image, and that's just some scalar h. Okay, so when you upsample an image, so you have an image, you compute the gradient magnitude, you compute the sum, you get h. You upsample it, and you do the same operation, you get h prime. Well, when you're upsampling an image, you're not actually creating any information, and you're also not losing any information. So it seems like we should be able to predict what the relationship between h and h prime is without actually having to upsample the image to get that value. And so what is that relation? Well, it's not that hard to figure out. So the gradient and the upsampled image is always half the gradient in the original image. You're just stretching everything out. So if you had high slope in the original image, it's got half the slope in the upsampled image. So it's the gradient magnitude is half of the corresponding location, but there's 4 times as many locations. So we'd predict that the value should be approximately 2. I say approximately because there's some discretization effects, and therefore these relations only hold approximately. Okay, this makes sense. And we went out and we actually performed experiments to test this, and these experiments don't show us anything surprising. It's what we'd expect. We actually went and took a data set of images, computed h and h prime, so computed the scalar, upsampled the image, computed the second scalar, and histogrammed that ratio. So this is for something like 1,000 images, what the distribution of those ratios. So in fact, the mean is around 2, as we'd expect, and there's some variance because this is approximately. And this is for 2 different data sets of images. This is a data set of just images containing people, and this is images not containing people. So these will be the positives and negatives, say, when you're training a classifier. And so you in fact get this relation that the mean ratio of h over h prime is 2. Okay, so far I haven't told you anything surprising. But now what happens when we downsample an image? So now we are throwing away information. So first of all, what would happen if this image was smooth? Well, if this image was smooth, then really we just have this case reversed, and we just have the arrows reversed. And so if this was a smooth image and we downsampled this h prime, the ratio between h and h prime would be 1/2. Okay, sure. But it turns out that when we actually did this, the ratio turns out to be 0.32 an image. But the ratio of the statistics of the original ensemble of images and the zoom in will only depend on the relative scale change and not on the absolute scales at which those 2 ensembles of images were taken. And so this was work done in the 90s, and they were only looking at distributions of basically Fourier frequency of gradients. But really, you would expect this if the world does in fact have this fractal structure, that as you zoom in, the statistics of those scenes are the same, it shouldn't really matter what type of feature you're measuring, whether it's actually gradients or anything else. So if that's the case, so first of all, let me actually say with the sort of the mathematical expression. So if you have some kind of feature you're computing over image at a scale s, the ratio of this for an ensemble of images should only depend on the relative scale of S1 and S2. So it should only depend on that ratio. So this should hold on average. So that on average, the expectation of this ratio should be just a function of S1 and S2. As soon as you have something in this form, it's just a matter of algebra to show that f must follow a power law. And so basically a feature computed at a scale s is going to be approximately, if you know the feature computed at the original scale, times some function, an exponential of, or a power of the actual change in scale.
Do you think this would The effectiveness of this observation would depend upon the feature, because some features which are textures, texture type features, will obey this very well, right? Where other features which might be dependent upon step edges might not agree with this as well. And step edges won't be 0.3.
So that's an excellent question. So first of all, there's nothing analytical that says this has to hold. This is what we'd expect if images had sort of this fractal structure. But everything we've measured for, it has held. But maybe I can actually answer that on a slide where I show for a couple different things. But we never actually tested sort of like canny edges. That would be a fun one to test for exactly the reason you're saying. So let me actually show first of all that this holds. And I'll get back to your question in a second. So this is a log-log scale. So if something follows a power law on log-log scale, it's a line. So this is the scaling factor. So this experiment that we performed where we actually did this downsampling and measured that the mean was 0.32. We could perform this for lots of different scale changes. That becomes a data point. And so for a downsampling of a factor of 2, we had a data point which was at 0.32. We did this for lots and lots of data points. And it turns out that a line is a really beautiful fit to this data. So it really does follow the power law. And then we can see just this had a mean, but it also had a spread of the distribution. And the spread gives you a sense of the error for an individual image. And so you can imagine that the further away in scale you were looking, the bigger that spread will become. So the more error will be introduced. And that's exactly what we see. We see that basically, so at a factor of 2, it had some kind of spread. And it's different for these two data sets. And as you increase the scaling, that spread increases. So this is the error sort of you get for individual images. So everything I've said sort of holds for an ensemble of images, and for a particular image it might fall on either side of that. And so this is the error. And so this tells you basically, if the further away you're predicting, the more error you're going to introduce. And I'll come back to this. I wanted to go to this because this was Larry's question. So different feature types. So first of all, so this is just the 3 different feature types, and we've tried this for others, and we've always seen this linear fit. The only thing that changes is the slope of the line. But it's always this power law is always obeyed as far as we've seen. So that works, but then for individual images, the slope of these, you can see that the scale of this goes up to 0.5, this goes up to 0.8, that one goes up to 0.6. So the rate at which the error increases does vary depending on the feature type. And so maybe one question would be, like Larry was suggesting, is there certain feature types for which it increases much, much faster? And that could be the case. That's a really good question. So here is sort of a visualization of this. So this is computing gradients, histograms of oriented gradients. So for every orientation, you want to compute the amount of gradient magnitude at that orientation. So for all the locations of the image where the gradient's at a certain angle, you take those and you sum the gradient magnitude, and you build a histogram. So we could do that for the original image, an upsampled version of the image, and downsampled version of those images. And we can correct. So power law tells us that, say, for example, when you double the scale of the image, we'd expect there to be, for doubling the scale, we'd expect there to be twice as much gradient, and for having the scale, there'd be 0.32 as much gradient. So we can correct for that. So you can remove that effect. And that's what we've done. So this is a histogram. So each color, so these are the orientation bins, and the colors correspond to the original upsampled or downsampled image, and they're corrected, and you basically see that the histogram, after applying these rules, are the same. So we could have computed the gradient magnitude at any one of these scales, corrected for sort of this effect that we now know, this power law, and there would be some error, but not much. So for this type of image, it really holds. And here's 2 other images where the predictions, the bars in all cases are relatively similar. So for these 3 images, it holds. Here's an example of an image where this completely fails. So this is a highly textured image. And so when we downsample that image, we basically throw away almost all the gradient information. And so even though we know we're going to lose some gradient when you go downsampled, we wouldn't have predicted that we lose that much. And so in this case, the approximation completely fails. And so if images in the natural world looked like this whole method wouldn't work. The whole reason the method works is because natural images follow natural image statistics. This isn't a natural image, basically. This is a Brodach's texture. It's a zoomed-in texture. So, in fact, in a room like this, I could imagine zooming in lots of regions where it's just a uniform texture, and really it has very unique statistics. It really doesn't have this property. If I take a picture of this room or of somebody's face, there's objects at different scales. There's lots of stuff going on. If I zoom in on a texture, say, or on a smooth region, it really has almost nothing going on. It loses that sort of fractal nature that we're depending on for this to work. Okay, so basically, without going into further details, we have a way, if you compute features at one scale, and so I've shown a lot of stuff for gradient magnitude, but it holds for all kinds of features. If we compute features at one scale, we could predict what those feature responses are going to look like at nearby scales. So without going into the technical details, we can basically, for a classifier, we can do this where instead of, so we don't want to predict too far away, so let's say we don't want to predict more than a factor of 2 away, or even a factor of square root of 2, and so we can compute this very sparse image pyramid, and then compute just upsample, downsample our classifier slightly. And so that allows us to basically get rid of this whole step of recomputing features at every scale. And this really should be applicable to any detector, because really the core idea is that you don't have to recompute your features. And so this is really a universal finding that we exploited here for our detector, but it's really applicable anywhere. So here's a different way of visualizing those same results I showed in the ROC earlier. On the y-axis is performance, on the x-axis is speed. And so lower here is better and to the right is better. This was our previous detector this is the one I described originally, and this is the sped up version. And so you see that there's a big difference in speed and almost no difference in performance. And this is for one particular data set, one particular setting. But we've run this on 6 different data sets, and always the sped up version is something like 1%, within 1% accuracy of the original one. So this prediction really is coupled with sort of learning methods that are robust to maybe slight noise in the features. This prediction rule really lets you save computational time without losing accuracy. And you kind of see where sort of other methods fall. Here's a method that actually gets slightly better performance that exploits motion information. But in general, our methods but it takes 256 seconds for one image. And really, that's not where we want to be. For some slight hit in performance, this is where we're at. And this is sort of, you can see sort of where other methods fall, and these are all sort of methods from the literature. So we really managed to speed things up while still maintaining top accuracy. Okay, how am I doing on time here? I've been talking about 40 minutes?
Go another 10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay. I might actually skip over a little bit of pose and then focus on the tracking and behavior. But basically, I'll just say what the method is without actually going into much technical detail, or what's sort of the key property. The key property of the method we had for pose estimation, so this is where you want to estimate geometrical configuration. So again, detection is sort of the first step where you find the objects, but now we want to extract more information about those objects. And so the pose is the first thing we'd want to extract, but we want an approach that's basically data-driven, accurate, and fast. So data-driven in the sense that somebody gives us labeled data and we learn from that, so we don't have something specialized to a particular domain. Accurate for obvious reason and fast. In this case, the method here takes about 1 to 5 milliseconds to do an estimation for a single location, which is fast enough. Basically, I'll show some applications of detection and pose estimation is fast enough to do real-time pose tracking. The key thing behind this method, like I said, I won't go into too much detail. So pose estimation is essentially a regression problem where you have your data and you're trying to get some kind of continuous variables out which describe your data. And so it's you could set it up as a learning problem. You have your training examples and you have your output pose. And it's just a regression. It's just a function from your input to some continuous multivariate space. The problem with setting it up like that is really pose is something much, much more than an arbitrary thing to regress to, in the sense that pose is geometrical configuration. You can go back to an image and you can plop down your pose estimate, and what you can basically do is for a given pose estimate, you can take new measurements conditioned on that pose from an image that tell you basically if your estimate of the pose is good or not. So that's very different than, let's say, you're trying to regress and predict the age of a person, where you can do that. That's a learning problem. In some ways, it's the same learning problem, but in some ways, it's an arbitrary number. There's nothing you can do that once you get an age estimate for someone you can do and measure different features. Now, maybe there is, but at least it's not as obvious. With pose, with geometric configuration, it's very obvious how to go back to the data and how to get new features. And by setting up the problem like this, so instead of having a generic regression problem, but having this problem where you actually know its pose, we can go and get good results instead of using 1,000 training examples, using something like 50. And we can get very good results. And so I won't, again, talk about sort of the details of that work. I'll say a little bit about it in the context of applications to tracking, where we're actually tracking the pose over time. So one of the things I've been involved in at Caltech is collaborations with groups in biology that want to do animal tracking. So looking here, these are just different domains that we've looked at. So these are all collaborations with different groups at Caltech. The video seems to be stuttering a little bit. Let's see if I could restart those. There we go. And so you can see that there's, in some ways the domains are easy because we know it's not arbitrary images in the world. There are a specific set of images. On the other hand, there's a very large diversity of type of setups we wanted to work with. And this is one of the things where having a very data-driven approach helped us because we could basically go into any domain, train our algorithms for that domain, and we could be sort of agnostic as to exactly what that domain is. And so let us produce very effective tools. So basically what we would do is we have users go and label data for us. Right, no problem. That's easy for biologists to do. We'd then go and train classifiers and pose estimators for these objects. So these are mice, and so we learn basically the standard: is it a mouse or not a mouse? And if it is a mouse, then learn the pose estimation for it. And then basically what we do is we actually run that independently on every frame of the video. So exploiting this notion of tracking as repeated detection. And so we run both the detection on the whole video, and then for every detection we run the pose estimation. And then we try to find a sequence of poses that explains away all of these observations. And so what that lets us do, basically, there's going to be hallucinated detections sometimes. Our detectors aren't perfect. And then there's going to be misdetection. So this mouse in the corner here is barely visible. But using temporal information, we can make up for a lot of those mistakes. And so the idea, I'll just go through this briefly, is if you have a bunch of observations at each point in time t, and you maybe have some kind of score for that observation, and you want to solve for track. So every point in time t, you want to assign the pose for the object. And so here, the pose could just be, in this case, I just represent it as a one-dimensional number, but the pose can be some arbitrarily complex pose estimate, as long as you have some notion of distance between the poses. And basically, you can set this up as a big optimization problem, where the goal is to find sort of a solution that explains away most of your observations, and then you could kind of hallucinate the missing detections and get rid of the false positives. And one of the key things that actually let us make this work well is, so normally in object detection, if you have a sliding window detector, what happens if you have an object and you have a lot of windows sort of nearby that contain that object, you get the detector to fire in every one of those windows. And so then you have some kind of post-processing heuristic, non-maximal suppression it's called, where you actually go and say, well, all of these probably belong to one object. The really nice thing here is we don't have to make that decision ahead of time. The non-maximal suppression can be folded into the tracking. So that when we're trying to use we don't have to make a decision ahead of time to actually group those detections and make, let's say if we have a bunch of detections close together, which actually were due to two objects, we lose those if we just applied some non-maximal suppression heuristic. By folding it into the optimization of the tracking, it solves both problems at once and it gets much better results. So that was one of the key observations. And we've run this, and so running it on, say, a 24-hour video takes about 24 hours. So it's a batch process, but it takes it's about real time. It just runs offline. And we've tested this over hundreds and hundreds of hours of video. And in fact, we've had sort of two publications with biologists, a recent Nature paper and another work where we've really been able to do some nice biology, some nice science with this. I won't tell you too much about that. I'll just show you some sample results. So this is tracking just center position. And again, we run this over hundreds and hundreds of hours. It has to be very robust. If you lose the objects, you have to regain it. And it really, we've tested it under these scenarios, and it really works quite well. So these are mice. So this was for the Nature study. Here's another example. Actually, this is one of my favorite. Oh, sorry about that. This is one of my favorites in the corner here. So this is actually tracking pose, in which case it's just an ellipse with an orientation. And you can see the biologists reach in with their hand in the middle of the video and put that plate in. The lighting changes, everything changes. And maybe we're tempted to tell sort of our users, the biologists in this case, to, you can't do that. Our algorithm won't work if you stick your hand into the cage. But really, that's our job to make that work. And I really like this video because sort of that happens, that the hand reaches in, the lighting completely changes, and the algorithm is completely unfazed. And I think that's the kind of thing those are the kind of techniques we really need to push on vision. Here's another example. This is some work at EPFL on tracking pose of fish. So I wanted to just very quickly tell you about my work in behavior recognition before wrapping up here. So again, extracting even more information about what the objects are doing. So this is faced with a series of domains like this. You can ask, well, so here are some maybe two training examples and what testing example on the right. And again, it's stuttering. There we go. And so you can say, well, what's sort of similar about the image in the right column, the video in the right column to the two in the left? And the way we approach this, and something that's proven very, very effective and has become fairly widely adopted in the community, is basically by saying, well, let's treat this. So for object detection, one of the things people do is treat an image as a bag of words, as a bag of patches. We said, let's treat video as a bag of spatial-temporal words. And so you basically take a video and you run some kind of separable linear filter. So these are Gabor filters in time and Gaussian derivatives in space. And you run the derivatives, you run these linear filters, separable linear filters. So it's a very efficient operation over the image. And you look for maximum of the response of these linear filters. So sort of something equivalent to, say, SIFT, where you're trying to find interest points in the spatial, but now you're doing over space and time. And so now you have a video, and you can represent it by space-time interest points. And so now you can do kind of a bag of words approach, where you have video, you detect these interest points. You can then form clusters of these. I mean, very analogous to bag of words. Look at a sort of a histogram of them, and the video's clinky again. Come on, video. Well, it's going to be chunky, I guess. And then you can characterize a new behavior based on the presence of certain words and certain words that aren't there. So this is a work we published in 2005. And since then, this kind of bag approach to video, bag of words approach to video has become very widely adopted. So this kind of thing is used with sort of a lot of things on top, and a lot of details have changed in how people do it. But this sort of framework has become one of the de facto ways of doing behavior recognition now. And in fact, this work was published in 2005, so I could show you some results from 2005. I took a paper from last year, from 2009, from a separate group that was doing an evaluation. And so they're referring to our method as cuboids. And so this, mind you, this is 5 years later. So they were taking our methods from 5 years ago, code that we have online, and comparing it to lots of different methods. Turns out that we're not doing that bad. We're still, our algorithm with just our base algorithm 5 years ago with some minor tweaks in terms of how the descriptor is doing, is still performing on these. So these are 3 different data sets. Is still up there in performance. This actually really surprised me because I thought in 5 years we would have been kind of blown out of the water by now. We introduced this idea of using bag of words for video for recognition, but we kind of thought, well, by now so many things will have changed. Turns out it's actually still working reasonably well. Okay, so that sums up the technical content, and I won't keep you guys here much longer. But I wanted to sort of say what are sort of some of the next steps here that I plan on pursuing. So one of the things is I've talked about sort of these different modules a bit in isolation. So I've talked about detection, I've talked about pose estimation, and then tracking, which takes the poses and the detections and then does the tracking and the behavior. And I've talked about them very independently, like each one very sort of, this is all information we're tracking about an object, but it's sort of a linear, sort of sequential pipeline. And really, I don't think that that's the right way of doing it. For example, when I was showing you the results on detection, it wasn't correctly getting this guy because he's in a weird pose. So doing detection then pose estimation, so having the arrow this way, I don't think it's good enough. I think when we do detection, we want to have a notion of pose. So we really want to have one feed into the other, combine those more closely. So have features that are conditioned on the pose, which is what we're doing for the pose estimation, but go back and actually have those help us with the detection. Likewise, for example, the tracking. So we're using the detection and the pose to feed into tracking. We do independent detection and we do independent pose estimation every frame, and then that we basically merge that over time to give us a track. But really, if you have video, you should be able to do so much more in terms of actually going from the tracks and then helping your detector. And you can imagine different ways of doing that. So you can imagine it as sort of a semi-supervised form of learning where if you have a video and you have a detector that sort of works, then you can specialize it to that video, or you could use it to get more training data. So there's lots of things you can do, but I think, and then again, the behavior and tracking. So right now, I mean, those results on behavior recognition I was showing was assuming you basically had one object in the scene and it was basically moving, but there was not much other stuff moving and there wasn't multiple things interacting. And really, that's too naive. You really want the tracking to feed into that. And you really want all of these to be merged more closely together. So for example, like the detection and the pose is something I want to pursue very short term in terms of getting the pose to help you with the detection. I think that would really help Maybe not so much on the upright pedestrians when they're small resolution, but when there's sort of more articulation and higher resolution. So the other thing is this is such a rich problem area. I've sort of presented 4 particular types of information you might want to extract, but really there's so much information to capture and so much information that we want to extract about objects in a scene. There's so much we can do with this. And that's really the direction I want to go, is really be able to capture a lot more about the objects, not just finding the objects and saying some basic information about them, but really there's so much rich information in the visual world, and really try to capture more of that. So before I conclude, I just wanted to say I've sort of been involved in a lot of other projects, sort of in a lot of other areas, and if anybody's interested in discussing these sort of offline in our one-on-one meetings, I've done a lot of work in applying learning to problems where traditionally more designed algorithms have been using. So posing those as machine learning problems, and we've gotten some good results for, like, say, edge detection or learning descriptors. I've also been involved a lot in manifold learning, so we had some work on that. Also, I've been very interested in sort of extensions of learning to sort of beyond just here are your positive and negative examples. But so, for example, one approach was multiple instance learning, when you have when your data, instead of being independent instances in a bag, they actually fall in a manifold. Anyway, if any of these things interest people, I'd be very, very happy to talk about these during one-on-one. All right, thank you. So, questions?
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you.
All right, thank you.